This is a guided meditation given by Swami Vivekananda in one of his Raja Yoga classes. It's a very ancient Sankhya Vedanta meditation, calming the lake of the mind. Let us close our eyes and picture the mind as a calm lake stretched before us. Let the mind drift. See how thoughts come and go as bubbles rising and breaking on the surface, becoming ripples that are ever widening circles. Make no effort to control your thoughts, but watch them. Follow them in your imagination as they rise, break, and float away. No, I am not the mind. I see that I am thinking. I am watching my mind act. Hold fast to the idea. I am the witness, watching my mind drift. The mind is not I. Watch the mind as a thing entirely apart from yourself. Identify yourself with God, the Supreme Self, never with the mind or matter. Be the witness. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. So, our first topic today will be Swami Atmarupananda speaking on approaches to Advaita Vedanta.
So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Mataji, for the introduction and for also hosting this retreat workshop. It's a special pleasure for me to be back here in Dallas, center which I have great admiration for. You've done wonderful work, Mataji and the devotees, in building a beautiful community, a beautiful center. And you really have something very special here in Dallas, and hope that you recognize that, not in an egotistical sense, but in an appreciative sense, so that you can further foster the work here. through cooperative effort, cooperation between the spiritual leader of the center and the devotees, then great things can be done. As great things have been done here, and further great work will be done here. So it's wonderful to see the life of the center and the way things have grown and developed here over the years. It's also a pleasure to be here with my colleague, Swami Atmarupananda. As Brahmaprana said, he is not accepting invitations for this school year, fall and spring, because of his commitments at Harvard. But he did accept this invitation. He became a good friend of mine while I was in Bellarmine. And he also was at the training center as an acharya, as a teacher. And so it's a pleasure to be here with him as well. As Mataji said in her introduction of him, he's well known as a YouTube phenomenon. And I saw that myself when he visited the United States for the first time. And I happened to be visiting from India, and he had come to visit from India. And I went with him to Trabuco from Hollywood and was showing him around. And we were coming back, we came back to Trabuco from an outing, and we're walking down the pathway, and from behind us someone called out and said, "Maharaj." And so I thought that they were meaning me because I had lived at Trabuco and the Swami was new from India. And so I turned around and said, "What?" And he said, no, not you, him." And the Swami turned around and said, "Me?" I said, "Yes, aren't you the Swami on YouTube?" So that was my first awareness of just how much of a YouTube phenomenon he was. So the topic for this first session is approaches to Advaita, approaches to non-dualism. So one thing that we should understand is, the first thing for me to understand is, up until when do I have? Oh, it's right here in front of me. Until 9:45. Good. Okay. So just exactly half an hour. So approaches to Advaita. So the first thing to understand, besides how much time I have, is the fact that Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is not a path. The path of knowledge is not really a path. It's a superhighway with many, many lanes. Each of the yogas is a vast field. In fact, Swami Vivekananda divided the whole field of religious endeavor, the spiritual search, into 4 yogas. All religions all religions and the teachings of all religions can be fitted within, can be analyzed according to these 4 paths. And so each path is not really a path, one place where you walk in a linear fashion. Each one is a vast field of spiritual endeavor and spiritual practice. And so Advaita, the heart of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is such a vast field. And so there are approaches. There are paths within the path of knowledge. And so to give some sort of analytical structure to an approach to the approaches to Advaita, we can think in terms of a triad which is found in all of experience. We find that there's the knower, the object known, and the knowledge itself. There's the lover, the beloved, and the love flowing between them. There's the seer, the seen, and the process of seeing, etc. And so there is in the spiritual path, there is the seeker, there's the goal which is sought, and then there's the path of discipline which leads to the goal. So in Sanskrit terms, it all fits together very beautifully with the Sanskrit terms, and that is the sadhaka, the spiritual aspirant, the sadhya, the goal of your spiritual search, and sadhana, the path that you follow. So I'll use that framework for very loosely for understanding some of the approaches to Advaita. And so one of the reasons for beginning with this topic is so that you don't think that Advaita means one small, well-defined path that everyone follows in the same way, that there are different approaches. And so taking that model, let me first begin with a couple of preliminary considerations. One is that there is a well-known path in non-dualism, which is a combination of non-dualism and the path of bhakti, devotion. And many people, there are many people who surely, not just probably, surely the numerical majority of people in the world who are on a spiritual path are following a path of devotion. And so whenever there's the topic of non-dualism, the path of knowledge, many people want to know, well, how can I combine that with devotion? And yes, that is possible. It's been done for ages. There are many examples of people, great saints, who have combined the two. Again, I don't want to overburden you with Sanskrit terminology, so you don't need to remember this, but some people will recognize the term, and that is jnana mishrita bhakti. That is devotion which is mixed with knowledge. And so that also is a path. You find people like the great Dhyaneshwar from Maharashtra, a great saint, and the first one to use the vernacular Marathi for literary purposes. He was the father of literary Marathi. He was a great example of one who combined devotion and knowledge. But today I'm not going to talk about that. That's a wonderful subject in itself. But in order to understand Jnana Yoga well, we first have to understand what it is in itself. So that's what I'm going to speak about. And also another preliminary consideration is that there are many, many practices, specific disciplines within Jnana Yoga. I'm not going to talk much about those in this first session. I will as we go forward, but not in this first session, because I'm speaking at a higher level of abstraction than specific practices, which are many. But I'm speaking more of approaches, that is, mental contexts which we use for following the path of Advaita. So in general, the path of Advaita, the path of knowledge, let me speak in terms of the path of Advaita, the path of non-dual knowledge, is a path for knowing, for coming to know directly the non-dual reality. That is Brahman, as it's called in the Vedanta tradition, or the Atman, because according to Advaita, Brahman, the cosmic reality, the reality which is behind this universe. If we could go beyond the veil of name and form, what we perceive in this universe, we would find this luminous, non-dual being. And the reality of myself are the same reality. The internal reality and the external reality are the same. And so the path of non-dualism is the path of Advaita is the path to know directly this non-dual reality. And here, knowing that reality doesn't mean intellectually knowing it. When I first began to read about Vedanta, I read a wonderful book called The Spiritual Heritage of India by Swami Atmarupananda. And in that he mentioned the 4 yogas, among many other things. But when I came to the 4 yogas, I thought, well, I don't know that I have much devotion. I would like to have devotion, but I don't feel much. And selfless activity, I'm more a thinking type. I'm not so interested in that, I thought at that point. And meditation, I haven't found a teacher, so I don't know how to meditate. But here, the path of knowledge, the path of philosophy. Now that I can think, and I can learn, I can study. So there's a path for me. Of course, I realized after time that the path of philosophy doesn't mean the path of thinking about philosophy. So here, knowing this reality means knowing it in immediate experience through realization, direct realization. Not conceptual knowledge, not reading books, not philosophizing, not getting the ideas straight, but direct perception of the reality itself. As Swami Vivekananda says, if there is a God, I must see God. It's not enough to say, oh, God exists and I love God and there is a God, I believe in God. No, I must eventually come to a point where I see God, realize God in direct experience. If there is a soul, Swami Vivekananda goes on to say, then I must see the soul, I must experience the soul. And so to know the non-dual reality means that. And so the path of Advaita is the path for knowing in direct experience that non-dual reality which I am, which everyone is, which everything is, which is the reality behind the appearance of this universe. So one of the first distinctions I want to mention between between methods of approaching Advaita is as far as the goal that we're seeking, what it is that we're seeking. And one distinction is that it's possible to seek non-dual knowledge by seeking it objectively, like in the sense of what is the reality of this universe? What is behind all of this that I see? What is the source of all of this? What is the foundation of all of this? And so that is seeking the reality of this that I experience, seeking it in the objective. That's not a path that you find that well developed and that much talked about, because it was found early on in the Upanishads and the later Advaita tradition, that it's for most people more fruitful, if you're looking for a non-dual reality which you are, to inquire within yourself, who am I? So yes, it's possible to inquire, what is this? What is the source of it? And you find that inquiry in the Upanishads. What is existence itself? All that exists, it shares the fact of existing. You exist, the chair exists, the building exists, everything exists. The fact of existing, everything shares. And what is that? What is existence itself? And to seek within this universe the reality of existence. But again, the primary approach that was followed in the path of Advaita was to seek, who am I? Who am I? And in other talks I'll come to why it is that path was the major approach. Why it is that most people seek in the approach to non-dualism to know who they are. Because if the reality here is the same as the reality there, what is closer to me than myself? What is more known to me than myself? And yet what is more a mystery to me than myself? And so for most people the approach to Advaita is a subjective approach. But there is the objective approach also, so that should be stated. Then the state sought, also the sadhya, the goal that we're seeking. There's a difference in the state sought by people on the path of knowledge, the path of non-dualism. For some people, it's the search for a state that is the transcendent state of nirvikalpa samadhi. That is where the mind dissolves into the reality itself, and nothing but reality is left. That is where the very appearance of this universe, the appearance of myself as separate from the universe, all of that is transcending. It's not that you leave this world and go somewhere else. No, all of this disappears into the highest state of awareness where there's no time, there's no space, there's no relationship, just reality. That's a very difficult thing to conceptualize. In fact, it can't be conceptualized. It's beyond conception. But we can get ideas of it, so at least we have something to aim towards. And so you'll find, for instance, in the Ramakrishna literature, there's great emphasis on the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, the highest realization as a state where the mind itself dissolves back into its source, which is pure consciousness. That may sound very strange, because what would I do without a mind? Well, if we could do that, we would see that the mind isn't necessary. That I am that reality, and just to be that reality is itself the highest blessedness, the highest perfection. And so some people seek that as their goal. Other people seek more a state of insight into reality. They're not so concerned with reaching a state of mind, or that a state beyond the mind. They want to know that which is beyond the mind. They want to know that which is beyond the body. They want to know that which is beyond the sense of distinction, that which separates me from everything. And so their goal is more phrased in terms of insight, knowledge into reality, not, again, intellectual knowledge. We start with intellectual knowledge. We have to have an intellectual knowledge to know what to do, how to proceed. But the goal is not intellectual knowledge. The goal is direct insight into reality. Now because I'm talking about the goal here, it's difficult to conceive of, because we're talking about the very highest reach of spiritual life. There are many great saints recognized around the world who had never attained to the non-dual state, but they were great saints and recognized as great saints. And so when we speak of the highest non-dual goal, we're speaking about a very, very rarefied atmosphere, which is, again, beyond the reach of mind and speech. So speech can't describe it, the mind can't conceive of it. But, again, coming back to the main point right now, some people conceive of it and aim towards it as a state of mind, that is, as a state the mind attains until the mind itself dissolves into that state. It's resolved back into its source, which is the reality itself. And other people conceive of it as a state of insight, just knowing the reality itself. Now, to make that a little bit clearer, something which, again, can't be described and can't be conceptualized, it's hard to make it clear. But to make it a little bit clearer, so we have something at least to think about, something to understand. Sri Ramakrishna, for those of you who have studied the life of Sri Ramakrishna, he spent, after his attainment of Nirvikalpa Samadhi through his guru Totapuri, and after spending time with Totapuri, once Totapuri left, he spent 6 months in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And that was always accessible to him, that rarefied state. And so you'll find in books like the Great Master, Lila Prasanga, or the Great Master, or Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play, as a more recent translation entitles it, you'll find a great deal of discussion of this state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But then when you come to someone like Ramana Maharshi, who is universally recognized as a fully illumined soul also, not as an incarnation, as Sri Ramakrishna is said to be, but a fully illumined soul. He talks about Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but he's obviously not talking about the same thing that Sri Ramakrishna means when he talks about Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So Nirvikalpa Samadhi, in the descriptions of Sri Ramakrishna, the body itself stops, the heartbeat stops, the breathing stops. A doctor was present once when Sri Ramakrishna was in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and other people around, so such incidents are recorded. The doctor touched his open eyeball, and there was no reaction, no batting of the eyelash or anything, no reaction. Imagine that, touching the naked eyeball with his finger, and no reaction, not even an involuntary action. If someone touches our eyeball, or goes to touch it, they won't get very far, will blink before they even touch it. It's not that we think, oh, they're going to touch my eyeball and I have to blink. No, you blink before you even know what's happening, because of an automatic response. But in him, there was not even that involuntary response, putting the finger on the eyeball. The breathing stops, the heart stops. And one is immersed in a transcendent state of infinite bliss, infinite knowledge, infinite awareness, infinite blessedness. Now, Ramana Maharshi, when he speaks of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he says that when my eyes are open, I'm in Savikalpa Samadhi. When my eyes are closed, I'm in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But he's still breathing. His heart is still beating. He used to say that a dog in the ashram, a particular dog in the ashram that would stay around him, that this dog is always in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Well, the dog was not like that. In a trance, the dog was walking around, eating its food, lying down, getting up, barking. but he said this dog had attained to Nirvikalpa Samadhi and was always in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. That's not the state that Sri Ramakrishna was talking about, and yet it was a state of knowledge. Ramana Maharshi, again, is obviously, if you read his life and his words, you see that this was a man who was a man of the highest knowledge. And so his knowledge came as insight, direct experience, direct knowledge. I am the Atman, not in words, not in concepts, but he knew his identity as himself, and knew this universe to be just an appearance. And yet, it was not in the form of a state where the breathing and every other vital function disappeared. Even after his illumination, when Ramana Maharshi was young, he was a young boy of 16 when he attained to illumination quite spontaneously. After that, he went to Tiruvannamalai in South India, and at first lived in a basement room, which I've seen in the temple at Tiruvannamalai, a Shiva temple there. And he just remained in meditation. Again, he was breathing. As often as eyes were open, he would look around, and yet this sounds terrible until you understand what was going on. There were worms, a type of flesh-eating worms, that entered into his legs and were eating his flesh, and yet he didn't even bother. So he was so transcendent over the body that these worms eating his flesh, it didn't bother him. He wasn't. He saw that the body is not who I am. I am the infinite consciousness. And he carried for the rest of his life the scars from where these worms had buried through his flesh, burrowed through his flesh. So that was for Ramana Maharshi. You see, there was this state of insight that he was in, where he knew the truth. He was immersed in the truth. It was experiential truth, but it didn't matter what state the mind was in for him. And so again, there's people who seek the state of non-dualism through the cultivation of a state of mind which leads to that reality. There are others who seek it through direct insight. But one thing that's important to realize is that for both, whether you're seeking insight or whether you're seeking a state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is actually beyond all states, the experience that you're seeking is completely transformative, eternally transformative, where you're not at all the same person that you thought you were. Now, I should explain that. Everything with Advaita needs explanation, because it's contrary to our common sense experience of the world. And so it said, those who have attained to that state, it said that part of the realization is, oh, this is what I was always. Why didn't I see it? I've always been this. I am the reality, the infinite reality. I'm that and nothing else. It was so obvious. Why didn't I see it? Why didn't I see it? It's what I always was. And yet, somehow I didn't see it. And so it's an experience which is completely transformative. It permanently changes your idea of who you are, and yet it's what you always were. What you are now, what you were, what you will be. Even in saints around the world, you find the recognition of this. And the great Meister Eckhart, the 13th and 14th century German mystic, Christian mystic, he was a thorough non-dualist. He says in one of his lectures, Blessed are the poor in spirit. He says that when one attains to this state, where one goes beyond God and everything that belongs to God, one attains that which one was, is, and am forevermore. That is, that which one always was, is now, and always will be. He doesn't even say always will be, because it's not future. It's the eternal present. I am that. And so in that reality, again, there's the complete transformation of one's perception, of one's identity, of one's knowledge, and one knows oneself to be the infinite reality in direct experience. So both of these are transformative, whether one seeks it through insight or through the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. One other example let me give. in my own experience, not my experience of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, I'm afraid. I wish I could say that. But experience of people. There was a great Swami Nirvananandaji, who was a disciple of Swami Brahmananda, a direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. I was extremely fond of Swami Nirvananandaji. He was one of those spiritual people who was like the bright sun that would frighten many people. But for some reason I felt extremely close to him, and I would go to him whenever I had a chance. And so I didn't go to him with this question, but somebody else did during my time. They went to him and said, Swami, or Maharaj as they would have addressed him, Maharaj, you were blessed by your Guru, Swami Brahmananda, who said, I bless you that you have the knowledge of Brahman in this very life. Have you had that experience? And Swami Nirvanananda said, by the grace of Sri Ramakrishna, by the grace of the Holy Mother and Swami Vivekananda, and by the grace of Swami Brahmananda, not a single desire ever arises in my mind. And the Swami said, the questioner, Swami said, but Maharaj, is that what is known as the knowledge of Brahman? Have you known Brahman? They said, again, the same thing. By the grace of all of these, I won't go through the names again, I have attained to a state where not a single desire arises in my mind. And so a third time the Swami asked, and again he said the same. And then the Swami, you ask something like that 3 times of a great soul, you don't ask a 4th time. And so there again, Swami Nirvananandaji didn't say, yes, I have spent, I have attained to Nirvikalpa Samadhi and so forth. He described it in negative terms as a state where there was no desire whatsoever. But no desire arises in what mind? A mind which has become completely free. A mind which has become completely free. But, at least as he said it, it was more a state of insight than apparently the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So, that's one difference in the approach. Another approach from the standpoint of sadhana, from the standpoint of spiritual practice. Some people approach it from the question, who am I? If you went to Ramana Maharshi and asked him a question, he would say typically, well, find out who is asking that question, and then you will have your answer. Or you go and say, Maharaj, I'm having trouble at home, my husband or my wife or my child or whatever is such and such a problem. He'd say, find out who is having the problem and find out if you have a problem. If you went to him and said, Maharaj, now I'm practicing yoga and doing these different things, he'd say, find out who it is who is practicing yoga. He says, Maharaj, I find it difficult to meditate, my mind can't be controlled. Find out whose mind it is. Then you have solved the problem. So he would always turn people back to the question, who am I? So one approach in Advaita as far as practice goes, and here I'm talking about broad practice in broad strokes, not small specific practices, is the search for who am I. Another approach which Swami Vivekananda emphasized, which is not contrary to who am I, that can be followed at the same time. But the approach that Swami Vivekananda emphasized was affirmation. To understand that I am Brahman, I am the Atman, I am consciousness itself. And to understand it so well, so deeply, gain the conviction that that becomes the overriding idea of who you are until other ideas of self-identity begin to melt away. So just the process of affirmation. So you see the difference between the two. One is not making any statements about myself, just asking, who am I? Trying to seek the source of this sense of self. We all have the sense that I am, but what is that? Who is this sense of self? To try to trace the sense of I, the sense of I am, back to its source. And the other is understanding first intellectually that I am the reality itself. And this is what I'll talk about in the other sessions. Swami Atmarupananda certainly will be speaking in various ways about that too. But in my own talks I'll be emphasizing that process. But having that conviction that I am the truth and holding on to it until it becomes a living reality. How does that happen? because we are that reality. And so it may seem contrary to our experience right now, and yet that's the reality of who we are right now, where we are in our present state, whatever that might be. That is the only reality about ourselves. And so if I hold on to that idea, once I've understood it, as a conviction, and I can get that conviction because I begin to see the truth of it, not hypnotizing myself to make myself believe something that's foolish, but no, I begin to see the truth of it. I become more and more convinced of it until that becomes the very center of my self-perception. And then my perception of everything begins to change. So who am I? And then affirmation. And then again, there's this other approach of just seeking insight. And it can be more, as I said at the beginning of this talk, where you're seeking what is this? So seeking what is existence itself? My own existence and the existence of all of this. That itself is an approach to try to understand existence itself. One of the wonderful things about the Upanishads is that they were interested in this type of question. They weren't interested in stories about who created the world and what did they make it out of and where did they get the stuff they made the world out of and all of that. No, they were interested in fundamental principle-based questions. What is existence itself? Or what is consciousness itself? I can make my whole spiritual search an approach to consciousness. What is consciousness itself? Trying to understand consciousness. Modern theoretical physicists, some of them now, are saying that the greatest search before science now is to understand consciousness. That's the greatest mystery which we haven't even touched. And Western civilization in general hasn't touched consciousness. And so to search what is consciousness? What is existence? And then for some, the primary approach to non-dualism is through meditation. Now for some on the path of knowledge, meditation is not important. And I'll try to get time, now time is up for this first session. I'll try to get time to explain why it's not important for some. But for others, that is their main practice, is a meditative approach. Because you find in the path of yoga, Raja Yoga, Patanjala Yoga, the yoga of Patanjali, that though he didn't teach non-dualism, he did teach a stage which was just one step below non-dualism. He didn't come to the final conclusion of non-dualism, but he approached it very close. And so he says in the Yoga Sutras that the goal of meditation is to bring the mind to a point where the mind is so calm, so tranquil, not a sleepy tranquility, but an awakened tranquility. The mind is so still, so calm, that you can clearly see the distinction between consciousness and the mind. And then you realize, I am consciousness, I'm not the mind. I'm not the mind itself, I'm consciousness. Now, Advaita says that then when that goes deep enough, the mind itself resolves itself back into consciousness. Patanjali doesn't talk about that. He ends with the state where you see the separation between the two. But for some, the approach is through meditation. So, let me conclude with that. There are other things that could be said about the nature of the world and all of that, whether you accept the world as real or unreal, whether you think that the world is inside of you, the whole universe exists within me, or I exist within the universe as I seem to perceive right now. There are all of these different approaches within Advaita. But final word for this session, my part of this session, is that all of these approaches, they're meant to lead to a state of complete transformation. Not actual transformation, because we are that reality already, but complete transformation in the sense that I know in direct perception, in direct realization, that I am that reality, and that I am that, was that, and always am that. That there's no distinction whatsoever. That I am the reality itself. So, in approaching that, there are many different ways of approach. So, now, yes, why don't we have questions and answers now, since we just had a guided meditation, and then I'll do a guided meditation later. So, yes, you have a question, Mark.
Maharaj Pranam, and thank you for the big picture. The question has two parts. One is Advaita Vedanta anti-intellectual? I'm just putting it
Oh, is it anti-intellectual?
Yeah, so I'm putting it in a provocative
Yes,
the background to this question.
Yes, yes, yes.
And the second one is, we have got these two texts which we shall use, Advaita Makaranda and Aparokshanubhuti. So, what is its relationship to what we are trying to achieve? That means spiritual enlightenment. How do we use these two texts, especially of these 2 days and later on in life?
Oh, good, good, good. Yes, this first talk was really an introduction to just to give a broad perspective to the path itself. So it wasn't specifically aimed towards the text we're going to use from here on. So first, the question about, is Vedanta anti-intellectual? Because for some people we get that idea when we read books about Advaita. People go to great lengths to say that, well, the spiritual path is not about book knowledge, that reality is beyond speech and mind, and so it's not a matter of scholarship, and so one should not get lost in the jungle of the scriptures, as Shankaracharya says in the Viveka Chudamani. But no, that doesn't mean that it's anti-intellectual. Vedanta recognizes the limitations of the intellect, that the intellect cannot give us truth. We can't realize the truth through intellectual understanding. But the intellect takes us a long way towards it. That is, if you come to me and ask me to teach you about meditation, and I say, well, go meditate. Meditation is not about lessons, and it's not about study, and it's not about reading books. Just go meditate. I haven't helped you much. I have to teach you, do this, do that. This is why you're doing it. This is what you're trying to do. This is the way the mind works. Read these books and you'll understand more. Do these practices and so forth. The intellectual formation in any path, even in the path of devotion, takes some knowledge in order to know how to follow the path of devotion. And so the intellect has a very important place. And in the path of knowledge, the path of non-dualism, it has a very important place for most of us. It didn't in the path of Ramana Maharshi, because he just spontaneously realized the truth. That's an interesting story in itself, which I won't go through now. But for most of us, we're not blessed with an experience like Ramana Maharshi, who wasn't seeking anything, just suddenly had the realization of who he was. We have to learn to reinterpret our experience of the world, our experience of who I am, our ideas about what is reality, what is valuable, what should be sought in life. All of these things we have to rethink, and that we do through the intellect, and we do it by knowing what is true. I have to analyze my present experience and see that my way of looking at the universe is based on a falsehood. I have to retrain my mind to think about the universe, to think about other people, to think about my relationships in other terms. I have to learn to interpret myself in different terms, not to think of myself in the ways that I have been thinking of myself, the ways that I've been taught since birth to think of myself, or if you believe in past lives, through many births, the ways that I've been taught to think of myself. I have to learn to reinterpret who I am, what the universe is, what is real, what is false, etc. And that is done through the intellect, and it's done through conceptualization. And so that has a great part to play in spiritual life. So it's not anti-intellectual. It just, the anti-intellectual statements in Vedanta are meant to emphasize that that's not enough. Learning to think the right thoughts is not enough. There are Advaita teachers nowadays who, and many of them are good people and sincere people, but they really just learn the talk and learn the conceptual part. And Advaita, once you get it, it's a little difficult in the beginning to understand it, but once you get it, the talk is easy. Everything is unreal, only Brahman is real, I am Brahman, and that's all you need to know, and then you've got the talk down. And so then every time anybody asks you a question or says anything, you just give some form of that back to them, and then it looks like you're enlightened. So Advaita statements about the limitations of the intellect are to say, no, that's not Advaita. That's the foundation for practice. Only the foundation for practice. But Advaita means you're seeking a complete transformation where you know in direct experience. When you say, I, that you see the Atman, the infinite Atman. And though in ordinary speech you may continue after illumination to use ordinary speech, but you know the reality behind that, and you know that you're just using transactional speech and nothing more. And so then the relationship to the texts. The texts are for a meditative inquiry. Texts are a great help in spiritual life. Swami Vivekananda used to point to Swami Atmarupananda, Latu Maharaj, who couldn't read and write, and say how amazing it was that this boy from a very poor family without any education, he didn't know reading and writing. He didn't know the first letter of the alphabet. Sri Ramakrishna tried to teach him and he couldn't get it, so he just gave up. So he couldn't read a letter of the alphabet. And yet he attained to the highest knowledge. So Swami Vivekananda said what he said about him was that he's so amazing because without the advantage of books and learning, still he attained to the highest truth. And so books are a great help in the spiritual life. They're not a substitute for spirituality, but they point to that which we are to do, where we are to go, and they give us inspiration. We can't always have spiritual company, but we can always have the company of a spiritual book, which keeps the mind on a higher plane. And you find that people who deal with ideas all of the time, that unless there's some other side to their life, that those who deal with ideas all of the time, there's a certain refinement about them, a refinement of mind and character about them. Because if energy is going towards mental things, then that energy becomes more refined. Our life becomes more refined. So the texts are meant for understanding first the words of the text, what is it saying, and then understanding what is the text saying to me. What does this mean for me? That was a great thing, a simple thing, but a great thing that one of my teachers taught me. He said that whenever you study anything, always study it with this idea: what is this saying to me? What is it saying? But what does it saying to me means, what can I do with this? Learning to see within an idea the practice involved. And so with these books, Advaita Makaranda and Aparokshanubhuti, these books that were written by people of illumination, great sages, they're all meant for practice. They're to teach you the truth so that you can put the truth into practice. And so when reading a spiritual book, in the beginning, when you come to spiritual life, just reading it for information is enough, because you're hungry for information and want to know. But once you've done that, then read it as a meditative exercise. What is this saying? Trying to imagine, even though these truths are beyond imagination, but the imagination is a wonderful faculty. In Vedanta, the imagination is not denigrated. The imagination can be used. Swami Turiyananda used to say that today's imagination is tomorrow's realization. So if you can read a text, a verse of the text, and try to imagine what it is it's talking about. What is the truth that it's talking about? Try to imagine it. And then try to see, what does that mean to me here and now? What do I do with it? So, any other question? Yes.
I have a question regarding bhakti and devotion.
Yes.
Bhakti and devotion are core philosophy of the Jivas.
Yes.
Advaita. But Advaita also talk about bhakti and devotion. So what is the difference between this?
Yes, yes.
Can you repeat the question so it goes into the...
Yes, sure. So the question is that the followers of dualism and qualified monism, the Shishtadvaita, Dvaita, they talk about bhakti, love for God, the personal God. But in Advaita also you find the mention of bhakti. So what is the difference? Well, first of all, for a strict Advaitin who is just seeking self-knowledge, for whom God, the Ishvara, God, doesn't come into the picture, for such a person, bhakti means dedication to the path to the teaching, and to the teacher. You find that among the non-dualists, that the devotion for the teacher takes the place of devotion to God. You'll find that even more than among the devotional teachers, the Advaitins, they speak of their teachers in the highest terms. And so devotion to the teacher takes the place of devotion to God for the Advaitin. And also, as I said, devotion means devotion to the path itself. But one more thing let me add in, and that is, as I said at the very beginning of this talk, it's possible to combine the path of knowledge and the path of devotion, so that one who's seeking self-knowledge is also seeking at the same time God knowledge, and sees the two weaving themselves together like this. They don't see a contradiction between the two. Swami Vivekananda, again, I keep referring to him, but he's a very good person to refer to, so I won't apologize for it. Swami Vivekananda says, be able to say at one moment, I am the Atman, I am transcendent over the world, I'm pure consciousness, I'm reality itself. And the next moment be able to say, oh Divine Mother, I have a stomachache, please help me. And then he adds, never be narrow. Never be narrow. Be able to say both. Any other questions? Yes, I saw that one first and then that one.
Can you describe consciousness with some examples so I can get a better understanding?
A good question, and an extremely difficult question to explain consciousness, and especially to explain it by examples, but I will try. Let me first say that in the West, when non-Vedantic inspired Westerners talk about consciousness, they're talking about conscious mental processes. You know that there's the idea of the unconscious mind, that Freud developed the idea of the unconscious, and Jung further developed it. So the idea of the unconscious mind, that part of the mind which is influencing us but which we don't see, we're not conscious of. And so the conscious mind is that part of the mind where we see what we're thinking about, see the operations going on in the mind. And so in the West, when consciousness is spoken of, they're speaking about that, the conscious mental processes. But it was the great discovery of India, one of many, but probably the greatest of all of the great discoveries of India. The consciousness was a reality itself, not a reality. Eventually they found it was reality itself. The consciousness is reality. Consciousness is truth. And consciousness there doesn't mean conscious mental processes. The conscious mind is that part of the mind which is illuminated by our awareness, that part of the mind we're aware of. But consciousness is the light which does the illuminating. And that's what I'll talk about in my next session, directly about that. But just to give a partial answer to your question now, consciousness, from a standpoint of our ordinary experience, we can understand consciousness as the light which illumines all of my experience. I'm aware of this world around me. It's because consciousness, which I am, is illumining the world for me. You may say, well, Swami, that's the sunlight which is illuminating the world for you. No. The sunlight is making things visible to the eyes, but what is making the sunlight itself visible? Consciousness. How do I know that there is sunlight? Because I'm awake and I see it. I'm aware of it. And so it's the light of consciousness which illuminates the world, makes it known to me, but then I'm aware of my body. It's the light of consciousness which makes the body, I can see the body. How? I'm conscious of the body. The light of consciousness is illuminating the body to me, even when my eyes are closed. I can see my thoughts arising. And as my mind develops through spiritual practice, the unconscious becomes more and more visible to the conscious mind. Then I'm aware, then everything begins to become illuminated by consciousness. So I'm aware of my mind, the operations of the mind. Eventually I can become aware even of the very seeds of thoughts coming up into the mind. And so I'm aware of the mind. Who is aware of the mind? If I'm aware of the mind, I can't be the mind because I'm looking at the mind. If I'm aware of the body, I can't be the body because I'm looking at the body. If I'm aware of the world, I can't be the world because I'm looking at it. I'm the light which illuminates everything, and that is the light of consciousness. So consciousness is the light which illuminates, which is illumination itself. And eventually we find, as I'll see in the next session, it doesn't even illuminate anything. It is illumination itself. So if there's time, how much time do we have, Mataji?
You have about 2.5, 3 minutes.
Okay, 2.5 minutes. I saw that when the far back against the wall, I saw him next, so I'm sorry, I'll try to get to you also if we have time. Sorry.
In logical way, we are all, each of us like a small speck in this whole universe. And when you talk about universal consciousness or Atma or Brahma, as a big infinity, so how can we say that we are same?
Yes. So the question is that we talk about universal consciousness and that I am Brahman, the reality itself, but I find myself to be a little speck lost in this vast universe, on an insignificant planet, on a very insignificant solar system, and one of countless galaxies, and all of this big talk about Brahman, and I am Brahman. So as we'll explain as we go forward with the text, the reverse is the truth. The universe is inside of me. The whole vast universe, all of the galaxies are inside of me. And so I won't try to explain that now. That's the goal of the whole weekend. So stay tuned. And so I'll try to fit your question in also. So yes.
Why does the mind have a tendency to create so many identities?
Yes. Why does the mind have a tendency to create so many identities within itself? That also is a big question, so I'll only give a provisional answer, and hopefully the further talks will elucidate that. We suffer from something, according to Vedanta, we suffer from forgetfulness of who we are. And when we're forgetful of who we really are, that opens the gate to imagining who we are. And so the mind is always imagining different things about ourselves. And then that is influenced by the whole course of our life. You're born into a family, and the family gives you an identity, connected to the family and connected to their perceptions and so forth. Then you meet friends, they color your perceptions. And then you go to school, and they give you further identities. You go to work and you get further identities there. And so the world itself and our own mind is constantly trying to define us. What happens when we wake up in the morning? First thing we do when we wake up in the morning is the mind tries to redefine itself. We've been in a different state, forgetful of this world. We wake up and we think, okay, I've got to get out of bed, I've got to go to work today, and I had this problem at work, and so-and-so said something to me the other day which I didn't like, I've got to get back to them and clarify that. And I go through this whole process as soon as I wake up of trying to redefine myself. And so our ordinary life is centered around definitions of ourself. And so that's all we have time for now, but that's at least a provisional answer. Okay.